Howdy, and welcome to Chapter 2, Video 3. Now, it discusses two cases here, and this is about standing again. And both of these have to do with, the first one has to do with interception of communication. And the injury prong, now let's go back and think about, you got to have an injury, it's got to be traceable, it's got to be redressable, okay, for standing. So the people in Amnesty International, individuals, knew that the intelligence agencies were spying on them, or thought they were, I should say. And so their injury was a reasonable likelihood the government would obtain their communications at some point. And the Supreme Court of the United States ruled, no, future injury is certainly impending. So no, it just can't be a fear or a likelihood. It has to have, what was our standards? Concrete and particularized, actual and imminent. A second was an interesting case, Spokeo v. Robbins, and it was a class action suit. Now, you have to be careful on class action suits. This is federal because I'll tell you right now, it's almost impossible to do a class action suit in Texas state courts. And it's a narrow ruling, and when you look at decisions, you have to think of the ruling in that context. A lot of our rulings, like we'll discuss later in the semester, Carpenter, last summer of 2018, was narrow. You have to be careful when it's narrow not to misinterpret it. So this was information, you can read the book, because you are reading the book, posted online, and that there was a risk of real harm. And so in this case, interestingly enough, they didn't really rule. They returned it to the Ninth Circuit to revisit the case. And so look at the legal process going there. But what is important is both of these cases are Supreme Court cases on standing on injury in fact, and they are being interpreted today that the Supreme Court of the United States has set a high bar for plaintiffs to bring a case alleging some kind of future intangible injury. These are cases on standing. So these are how the law is being interpreted now when we want to bring a lawsuit. So here's another interesting one. There's inconsistencies between the federal circuits. Get used to saying this. You'll say it a lot this semester because remember, unless it goes to the Supreme Court of the United States, we have 12 circuit courts, 12 federal appellate courts, review courts. So the Seventh Circuit, which is Chicago area, Indiana, Illinois, I can't remember what third state is, Wisconsin maybe. And the Seventh Circuit's given standing in data breach cases very leniently because it says it is the threat this is going to happen constitutes the injury. You have to have an injury. Don't lose that point. You have to have an injury. But what the court is saying is just the threat is injury enough. The Third Circuit, Delaware, those courts say, nope, you got to have a real injury. You can't say there's some indication, maybe potential harm. You got to show something real. So there's a split in the circuits, and we go back to this map. So the Seventh Circuit and the Third Circuit. And again, you're going to see this time and time again this semester. Now, the last prong is fairly traceable and redressable. These are difficult questions, and I'm not training you to be lawyers. If I were, we would spend a whole lecture, many of you standing on your feet, reciting case law, on just this element. It's a difficult question because how do we trace it, and then how do we redress it? And so fairly traceable is, how can I prove that the defendant mishandled my data and had my identity stolen? I had my identity stolen, but how can I prove that? And the redressability issue. Okay, how are we going to fix it? This is why when there's a data breach, what do companies do? They immediately credit your account and they give you free credit monitoring. Because all of a sudden you're like, I can't ask for any more. I'm not lost anything. It's redressable. The important thing I want you to take away from this, other than the process and how this works, is that standing is often the largest barrier for plaintiffs in data breach cases. Okay, 3 down, 1 to go. Back in a second.